Well, my journey to becoming an artist, I think it really started when I was a child. I grew up in rural New Brunswick in a family of 9 children, and I was, I think, quite a sensitive kid. I would venture out into the forests and fields around my home, and no one would really notice I was missing because there were so many children. And I learned about the process of drawing. When I spent time out in the forest and in the fields, looking at the structures of trees and using my hands to kind of get to know the structures, I think that sparked something in me that was quite deep and that stayed with me throughout the years. When I was 12, I acquired my first cheap set of paints, of oil paints, and that opened up the world of color, the world of the material of layering paint, and that further provoked my interest in engaging with the world through my hands, I guess, and trying to understand the world, the natural world, using my hands. So at that point, I guess by adolescence, I had settled on the fact that I wanted to pursue a lifetime of trying to make sense of the world using my hands. And that's what I did. I went to NSCAD University in Halifax and did an undergraduate degree in fine art and painting. And then I went to Calgary, the University of Calgary, across the country, to the mountains to pursue a Master's of Fine Art degree. Eric Cameron is a Canadian artist. He was teaching at NSCAD when I was there as an undergrad, and I sort of followed him out to the University of Calgary. His work is very much involves attention to process. So the act of it's almost a ritualistic act of making, and the outcome of that ritualistic act is the art, as opposed to the ritualistic act supporting the art. And I think that stayed with me for a long time. After grad school, I picked up oil paint again. I didn't do much painting in grad school. Really, I used everything but traditional art materials. And and when you pick up oil paints, it's a little like picking up a violin. It's a lifetime of learning to master this material, to really understand how to use the material to engage with the world around you. I was painting the figure at that point. I moved to Toronto and was a figure painter, had exhibitions here. I would describe my style then as kind of neo-Baroque, and the habit of obscuring the surface of the painting. So I would create the illusion of the form, and then I would start obscuring that surface after I spent all this time developing the image. That started then. This was in the 1990s. In 1997, I moved to Borneo, which is in Southeast Asia. There's a small country there. And I taught art to largely Islamic children, which was an interesting endeavor. And of course, painting the figure, the human body, the nude human body in an Islamic sultanate is illegal. So I had to change what I was doing. What I did is I started to focus on the texture and surfaces of the human body and baskets, and of course started to explore the density of the jungle, the rainforest in Borneo. And I think that's when I really was drawn to the power of the natural environment. That's when this fascination started with engaging with the dense living environment of the forest. In this case, it was a rainforest. I came back from Borneo in 2004, and I was living near the Niagara Escarpment, where I still live, very near the Bruce Trail, and spent a lot of time in the forest, walking the Bruce Trail. In the summers, attending the forests in northern Ontario, and continuing to use my hands to engage with the world in the forest. So that's kind of my story in terms of how I got from rural New Brunswick to here. In terms of what draws me to the subject matter that's on display here, the subject matter is really the forests of Ontario, the Carolinian and boreal forests in the north as well. I think it's a sense of time in the forest, and this is something that has been with me all my life. I at least become aware of the fact that there is this space where things are happening at a pace and in a scope that's much larger than what I experience day to day as a human being going through life 24 hours a day. Lifespan is so long. And in the forest, that whole thing, it all opens up in terms of a sense of time. Things are growing, things are decaying, new growth is developing, and I like immersing myself in that sense of time. I think my son had a turtle. His name was Sneaky. I don't know why he called him Sneaky. When Sneaky looked me in the eye, I knew that Sneaky would never read Shakespeare. That turtle had finite limits in terms of how its brain was able to interact with the reality that surrounded it. And I guess for me, I see myself kind of the same way. My brain and my capacity to understand and comprehend the complexity of the reality that I'm encountering, particularly in the forest, is way beyond my ability to understand and to certainly encompass with language. But I feel through painting and responding to my surroundings using watercolors in the immediate sense, but then going back to the studio and kind of immersing myself in the materials of paint and the textures of bark and moss and leaves, that I can sort of intuitively sense the reality of the forest, and in a way, the reality of being, what it is to be and exist. So, yeah, I think it's the power of the forest, the sense of the presence of a reality beyond the scope that I can encompass, but that's there, that draws me to the forest and draws me to the texture of bark and trees and so on. Hyperrealism, photorealism, they're very different things, but that's often a term that's applied to my work. Not often a term, but it is sometimes applied to my work. Surrealism as well, to an extent. And I think not so much photorealism. I associate that with the 1970s, a very objective kind of way to replicate the mechanics of photography. But I think hyperrealism I associate with artists, particularly sculptors like Ron Mook, in Canada, Evan Penny. And I think there is a commonality in the sense that I think they're using so much information, visual information relating to texture of skin, for example, that it's below the threshold or beyond the threshold of your perception, which causes this sort of mental buzzing. You're aware that there's information there, but you can't actually see it all, which creates a sense of life in a way. So that attempt to depict reality that is sort of beyond what's being represented, I think that aligns to an extent with what I'm doing, although I wouldn't characterize my work as hyperrealistic. I think in some ways the amount of visual activity that's going on in my paintings goes back to my time with Eric Cameron and my focus on process. So once I'm in the studio, I tend to get into this meditative state of mark making, this accumulation of marks, almost to the point where what's happening on the canvas is secondary to the process of laying down the marks. It's almost like a meditative tribute to the life that I'm depicting, or the life and death, I guess you could look at it that way. Yeah, and surrealism, I think, if one talks about surrealism, like back in the 1930s, with the early surrealists like Breton and Max Ernst um, and Picabia, I think these artists were very interested in trying to access the unconscious. This concept of the unconscious was, like Freud's idea, was relatively new at that time. And they were trying to access what they thought was a reality that was more real than our conscious reality. So I see a parallel there in terms of what I'm trying to do in my paintings. I'm trying to suggest or create this feeling of a sense of a place or a thing that is kind of on the periphery of our ability to know. So I think there's commonality there. So yeah, the last show I had at Abbozzo was 2019, 3 years ago, and usually I exhibit my work every 2 to 3 years, and at that time I was painting kind of untethered trees. I described them as kind of almost portraits of trees, and the focus was very much on this almost like an anthropomorphic form of the tree, and you could relate to it almost as a body and the texture of trees and the dignity of trees. And since that time, my attention has gone downwards and focused on that space between the sky and the earth, where the tree goes into the ground. That's why I call the exhibition Closer. I'm moving closer to the forest floor. And why am I doing that? I'm not exactly sure why. It seems to be what's happening when I'm going into the forest now. I'm becoming more aware of the context of the growth. And that space, I find it a really interesting metaphor, that the ground, particularly a tree going into the ground, it's the space that is kind of the liminal space. You think of sort of the dichotomy of reality. There is night and there is day. There is life and there is death. There is light and there is darkness. And the space that's in between, I think, is interesting, because I think that's the space where meaning is found. And I'm not talking about meaning that I can talk about. It's the meaning visually as an artist. The transformation, moss is found near the earth, and the moss is helping to transform the material of a tree into earth, which transforms again into another tree, etc. And so this sort of eternal cycle is happening on the forest floor. So that's where my attention has been of late, because I sense that's where the energy is. That's where the energy transfer is happening. When you're kneeling on the forest floor, looking closely at a stump, there is a resonance, at least for me, that I pick up. And when I'm in the studio, I try to revisit that through my painting. I guess, you know what, my process is probably the same process that's been carried out by landscape painters for millennia. Going back to Romans, going back to ancient Chinese painters. When I go into the forest, I mentioned the idea that I'm trying to sense life in the forest, and I try to capture it. So I carry with me watercolors and pencils and paper and so on. And when I can, I am drawn to an image, and I respond to that image fairly quickly. I try to create a sense of the feeling of the place, of being in the place, the sense of light, the sense of the forms. And I take photographs as well to record additional information. Then I go back to the studio and I sort through all of these drawings and watercolors and photographs. And I settle on an image that is provocative for me, and I start painting. And my painting is probably the same process that's been used by painters for hundreds of years who have used oil paint, laying down the underpainting, building up layers of marks. And I think it's this layering part that is distinctive for me anyway, and the process of this ritualistic almost layering of marks with the material. And I do think the material of oil paint, like mixing of the viscous paint, laying down the paint with your hand on the surface, there's a connection there between the forms that I'm painting, the bark, the moss, the crackling leaves, and the material of the paint. There seems to be this real communication that sometimes happens. I can get really close to it. And the other thing that's, I guess, noticeable about my paintings, and it's been the case for many years, is that there's a very resolved part of the painting, and there's a part of the painting that is not resolved. So when I say resolved, I mean you're looking at the painting and you see the forms, the illusion of actual forms, and then you're looking at another part of the painting and you see the material of paint dripping on the surface of the canvas. So yeah, I think that for me is important because it registers the fact that what I'm trying to do in the painting is try to capture an echo of the fact that in the natural world, everything is in flux. There's no state of finish. Everything is transforming all the time into another state. There's this continuity and instability that exists in the natural world. And I try to echo that with my paintings in the sense that they are static and there's an illusion, but they are also just materials on a surface, and it's not reconciled. It's sort of back and forth to an illusion, to material on a surface. And I think that instability of the image is something that's quite important.